Let me take you straight to the Bible verse for today, or rather two Bible verses. John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. In these two verses we have the Apostle John telling us what is the purpose of his gospel. He has written his gospel. That should lead us to believe in Jesus, who he is and what he's done. And that in turn leads to us having life which begins now and which carries on far more wonderfully for eternity in heaven to come. The gospel record leads to us believing in Jesus, and believing in Jesus leads to life. Gospel, believing, life. That is the chain reaction. Most of us, I guess, have a number of memories of what we might describe as the most exciting events in our lives. Now, I won't bore you with a record of my memories, but one exciting memory for me is of 10 or so years ago when I happened to be in Manchester. And it's the only time in my life that I've been there. I visited the John Rylands Library, and like any other member of the public, I was able to see a small fragment of a papyrus on which is written just a few verses from John's Gospel, chapter 18. This fragment of papyrus is known as P62, which doesn't make it sound terribly exciting, but it's almost certainly the earliest existing fragment of the New Testament in the world. It was found in Egypt, and it can be dated as having been written around the year AD 130. I don't understand how the experts are able to work this out, but nobody doubts that this is indeed the case. It's normally reckoned that John wrote his Gospel as an old man in the last decade of the 1st century AD, so the papyrus of John's Gospel, which that fragment in Manchester comes from, was circulating in Egypt within about 40 years of John writing his original version. While it may not be quite the same as putting our hands on the Apostle John's autographed copy of his very own first edition, if that were at all possible, in my reckoning it comes pretty close to it. Now, what makes this papyrus fragment so exciting is that it is one of many surviving copies of early manuscripts, or parts of, or of the whole of the New Testament. By early, I mean written in the first few centuries of the Christian era. By many, I mean thousands. There are no major differences between the text of these old manuscripts. Oh yes, there are some which are of minor importance, as you might expect when you get scribes making copies of the manuscripts in front of them, even very conscientious scribes, as most of them indeed were. Some minor differences, yes, but they really are of minor importance. By comparison, or rather by contrast, it is accepted by everybody that Julius Caesar led an expeditionary force to Britain in the mid-1st century BC, when, as he claimed, he came, he saw, and he conquered. Do you know how many ancient copies of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars are still in existence today? That's the title of his record of his campaigns. The answer is 10. And the oldest of those copies was written 875 years after the event. Now, when you set those figures against the ones which I mentioned a moment or two ago about the New Testament documents, you realise how reliable the New Testament documents are. We really must not be hoodwinked by people like Dan Brown, because we can be really sure that the Bible texts that we are privileged to read today are as near to rendering faithfully what was originally written as it is possible to be. We really are on incredibly sure ground, and those who doubt this have never looked at the evidence. The marvellous thing is that we don't need to be an expert in biblical scholarship to be a disciple of the Lord Jesus today. But being aware of this sort of thing can possibly give us greater confidence that when we hold the Bible in our hands and read its content, we are looking at a message that is true. John's words in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31 of his Gospel are for anybody and everybody who will respond to what he is telling us here. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Let's thank God for every opportunity to take to heart the things that are written for us. Paul tells the church in Colossae, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. In the book of Acts, in chapter 17, we meet men and women in a place called Berea, who heard the gospel through Paul and Silas, and then we're told they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So let us today be like the Colossians and the Bereans. Remember the chain reaction. The gospel leads to believing, and believing leads to life now and life to come. And very finally, some other words of the Lord Jesus in John chapter 10, verse 10. I came that they, that's to say we, may have life and have it abundantly.